How the war was fought at sea for thousands of years, the oceans have been battlefields. From wooden triremes ramming into enemy ships in ancient Greece, to towering warships blasting broadsides in the age of sail, to the modern era of submarines, aircraft carriers, and nuclear-powered fleets. The fight for control of the seas has shaped empires, changed the course of wars, and decided the fate of nations. Today, we're diving into the complete history of naval warfare, how war was fought at sea from the ancient world, all the way to modern times. Although the colonists ventured to challenge Britain's naval power from the outbreak of the conflict, the war at sea in its later stages was fought mainly between Britain and America's European allies, the American effort being reduced to privateering. The onset of the Revolution found the colonies with no real naval forces, but with a large maritime population and many merchant vessels employed in domestic and foreign trade. That merchant service was familiar not only with the sea, but also with warfare. Colonial ships and sailors had taken part in the British naval expeditions against Cartagena, Spain, and Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, during the 9 years of war between Britain and France from 1754 to 1763. Colonists also had engaged in privateering during the French and Indian War, the American phase of that broader conflict, the European phase of which was known as the 7 Years' War. The importance of sea power was recognized early. In October 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the creation of the Continental Navy and established the Marine Corps in November. The Navy, taking its direction from the Naval and Marine Committees of the Congress, was only occasionally effective. In 1776, it had 27 ships against Britain's 270. By the end of the war, the British total had risen close to 500, and the American total had dwindled to 20. Many of the best sailors available had gone off privateering, and Continental Navy commanders and crews both suffered from a lack of training and discipline. Early engagements and privateers. The first significant blow by the American Navy was struck by Commodore Esek Hopkins, who captured New Providence, Nassau, in the Bahamas in 1776. Other captains, such as Lambert Wickes, Gustavus Conyngham, and John Barry, also enjoyed successes, but the Scottish-born John Paul Jones was especially notable. As captain of the Ranger, Jones scourged the British coasts in 1778, capturing the man-of-war Drake. As captain of the Bonhomme Richard in 1779, he intercepted a timber convoy and captured the British frigate Serapis. More injurious to the British were the raids by American privateers on their shipping. During peace, colonial ships had traditionally traveled the seas armed as a protection against pirates. So, with the outbreak of war, it was natural that considerable numbers of colonial merchant vessels should turn to privateering. That practice was continued on a large scale until the close of the war under legal authorization of individual colonies and of the Continental Congress. Records are incomplete, but indicate that well over 2,000 private armed vessels were so employed during the course of the war, carrying more than 18,000 guns and some 70,000 crew members. In addition, several of the colonies organized state navies which also preyed upon hostile commerce. Those operations were of such a scale that they must be regarded as one of the significant American military efforts of the war. Together with the operations of a few continental vessels, they constituted the only sustained offensive pressure brought to bear by the Americans, which materially affected the attitude of the British people toward peace. By the end of 1777, American ships had taken 560 British vessels, and by the end of the war they had probably seized 1/500. More than 12,000 British sailors also were captured. Such injury was done to British commerce that insurance rates increased to unprecedented figures. Available sources of revenue were seriously reduced, and British coastal populations became alarmed at the prospect of Yankee incursions. By 1781, British merchants were clamoring for an end to hostilities. Most of the naval action occurred at sea. The significant exceptions were Arnold's battles against Carleton's fleet on Lake Champlain at Valcour Island on October 11th and off Split Rock on October 13th, 1776. Arnold lost both battles, but his construction of a fleet of tiny vessels mostly gondolas, gundelows, and galleys, had forced the British to build a larger fleet and hence delayed their attack on Fort Ticonderoga until the following spring. That delay contributed significantly to Burgoyne's capitulation at Saratoga in October 1777. French intervention and the decisive action at Virginia Capes, the entrance of France into the war, followed by that of Spain in 1779 and the Netherlands in 1780, produced important changes in the naval aspect of the American Revolution. The Spanish and Dutch were not particularly active, but their role in keeping British naval forces tied down in Europe was significant. The British Navy could not maintain an effective blockade of both the American coast and the enemy's ports. Because of years of neglect, Britain's ships of the line were neither modern nor sufficiently numerous. An immediate result was that France's Toulon fleet under d'Estaing got safely away to America, where it appeared off New York and later assisted Sullivan in the unsuccessful siege of Newport. A fierce battle off Ushant, France, in July 1778 between the Channel Fleet under Adiem. Augustus Keppel and the Brest fleet under the Comte d'Orvilliers proved inconclusive. Had Keppel won decisively, French aid to the Americans would have diminished, and Rochambeau might never have been able to lead his expedition to America. In the following year, England was in real danger. Not only did it have to face the privateers of the United States, France, and Spain off its coasts, as well as the raids of John Paul Jones, but it also lived in fear of invasion. The combined fleets of France and Spain had acquired command of the English Channel, and a French army of 50,000 waited for the propitious moment to board their transports. Luckily for the British, storms, sickness among the Allied crews, and changes of plans terminated the threat. Despite Allied supremacy in the Channel in 1779, the threat of invasion and the loss of islands in the West Indies, the British maintained control of the North American seaboard for most of 1779 and 1780, which made possible their southern land campaigns. They also reinforced Gibraltar, which the Spaniards had brought under siege in the fall of 1779, and sent a fleet under George Rodney to the West Indies in early 1780. After fruitless maneuvering against the Comte de Guichen, who had replaced d'Estaing, Rodney sailed for New York. While Rodney had been in the West Indies, a French squadron slipped out of Brest and sailed to Newport with Rochambeau's army. Rodney, instead of trying to block the approach to Newport, returned to the West Indies where, upon receiving instructions to attack Dutch possessions, he seized St. Eustatius, the Dutch island that served as the principal depot for war materials shipped from Europe and transshipped into American vessels. He became so involved in the disposal of the enormous booty that he dallied at the island for 6 months. In the meantime, a powerful British fleet relieved Gibraltar in 1781, but the price was the departure of the French fleet at Brest, part of it to India, the larger part under François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse to the West Indies. After maneuvering indecisively against Rodney, de Grasse received a request from Washington and Rochambeau to come to New York or the Chesapeake. Earlier in March, a French squadron had tried to bring troops from Newport to the Chesapeake, but was forced to return by ADM, Marriott Arbuthnot, who had succeeded Lord Howe. Soon afterward, Arbuthnot was replaced by Thomas Graves, a conventional-minded admiral. Informed that a French squadron would shortly leave the West Indies, Rodney sent Samuel Hood north with a powerful force while he sailed for England, taking with him several formidable ships that might better have been left with Hood. Soon after Hood dropped anchor in New York, de Grasse appeared in the Chesapeake, where he landed troops to help Lafayette contain Cornwallis until Washington and Rochambeau could arrive. Fearful that the Comte de Barras, who was carrying Rochambeau's artillery train from Newport, might join de Grasse, and hoping to intercept him, Graves sailed with Hood to the Chesapeake. Graves had 19 ships of the line against de Grasse's 24. Though the battle that began on September 5th off the Virginia Capes, known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, was not a skillfully managed affair, Graves had the worst of it and retired to New York, thus sealing the fate of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. Graves ventured out again on October 17th with a strong contingent of troops and 25 ships of the line. while de Grasse, reinforced by Barras, now had 36 ships of the line. No battle occurred, however, when Graves learned that Cornwallis had surrendered, although Britain subsequently recouped some of its fortunes. By Rodney defeating and capturing de Grasse in the Battle of the Saints off Dominica in 1782 and British land and sea forces inflicting defeats in India, the turn of events did not significantly alter the situation in America as it existed after Yorktown. A new government under Lord Shelburne tried to get the American commissioners to agree to a separate peace, but ultimately, the treaty negotiated with the Americans was not to go into effect until the formal conclusion of a peace with their European allies. The end of the war and the terms of the Peace of Paris, 1783, preliminary articles of peace were signed on November 30th, 1782. The Peace of Paris, which was signed on September 3, 1783, ended the U.S. War of Independence. Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States with western boundaries to the Mississippi River and ceded Florida to Spain. Other provisions called for payment of U.S. private debts to British citizens, American access to the Newfoundland fisheries, and fair treatment for American colonials loyal to Britain. Great Britain and the United States also agreed that they would share access to the Mississippi. The text of the treaty agreed to buy the new United States and the colonial power grade. Britain begins with the two countries pledging to reset their relationship after years of grinding war. George III and the United States, the treaty states, together seek to forget all past misunderstandings and differences that have unhappily interrupted the good correspondence and friendship which they mutually wish to restore, and to establish such a beneficial and satisfactory intercourse between the two countries, upon the ground of reciprocal advantages and mutual convenience as may promote and secure to both. Perpetual peace and harmony did that express that genuine feeling, or empty diplomatic platitudes, or a mix of both? Benjamin West provided one answer with a painting known as American Commissioners of the Preliminary Peace Negotiations with Great Britain. He began it in 1783, but only Americans would sit for him. He left the rest of his painting blank, because the British negotiators he intended to include did not make themselves available to him. West's painting became a telling symbol of the continuing rivalry between the two countries, which would erupt again in the War of 1812. France received Tobago and Senegal from Britain as a result of the American Revolution. The Dutch gave up to the British the Indian port of Nagapattinam and allowed British access to the Moluccas.
After years of relentless struggle, the American colonies achieved independence through a combination of strategic...
How did the American colonies win the war? In explaining the outcome of the war, scholars have pointed out that the British never contrived an overall general strategy for winning it. Also, even if the war could have been terminated by British power in the early stages, the generals during that period, notably Howe, declined to make a prompt, vigorous, intelligent application of that power. They acted, to be sure, within the conventions of their age, but in choosing to take minimal risks, for example, Carleton at Ticonderoga and Howe at Brooklyn Heights, and later in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they lost the opportunity to deal potentially mortal blows to the rebellion. There was also a grave lack of understanding and cooperation at crucial moments, as with Burgoyne and Howe in 1777. Finally, the British counted too strongly on Loyalist support they did not receive. But British mistakes alone could not account for the success of the United States. Feeble as their war effort occasionally became, the Americans were able generally to take advantage of their enemies' mistakes. The Continental Army, moreover, was by no means an inept force even before Steuben's reforms. The militias, while usually unreliable, could perform admirably under leaders who understood them, such as Arnold, Greene, and Morgan, and often reinforced the Continentals in crises. Furthermore, Washington, a rock in adversity, learned slowly but reasonably well the art of generalship. The supplies and funds furnished by France from 1776 to 1778 were invaluable, while French military and naval support after 1778 was essential. The outcome, therefore, resulted from a combination of British blunders, American efforts, and French assistance. British Empire, a worldwide system of dependencies, colonies, protectorates, and other territories that over a span of some 3 centuries was brought under the sovereignty of the Crown of Great Britain and the administration of the British government. The policy of granting or recognizing significant degrees of self-government by dependencies, which was favored by the far-flung nature of the empire, led to the development by the 20th century of the notion of a British Commonwealth, comprising largely self-governing dependencies that acknowledged an increasingly symbolic British sovereignty. The term Commonwealth was embodied in statute in 1931. Today, the Commonwealth includes former elements of the British Empire in a free association of sovereign states. Origins of the British Empire. Great Britain made its first tentative efforts to establish overseas settlements in the 16th century. Maritime expansion, driven by commercial ambitions and by competition with France, accelerated in the 17th century and resulted in the establishment of settlements in North America and the West Indies. By 1670, there were British-American colonies in New England, Virginia, and Maryland, and settlements in the Bermudas, Honduras, Antigua, Barbados, and Nova Scotia. Jamaica was obtained by conquest in 1655, and the Hudson's Bay Company established itself in what became northwestern Canada from the 1670s on. The East India Company began establishing trading posts in India in 1600, and the Straits settlements, Penang, Singapore, Malacca, and Labuan became British through an extension of that company's activities. The first permanent British settlement on the African continent was made at James Island in the Gambia River in 1661. Slave trading had begun earlier in Sierra Leone, but that region did not become a British possession until 1787. Britain acquired the Cape of Good Hope, now in South Africa, in 1806, and the South African interior was opened, up by Boer and British pioneers under British control. Nearly all these early settlements arose from the enterprise of particular companies and magnates rather than from any effort on the part of the English crown. The crown exercised some rights of appointment and supervision, but the colonies were essentially self-managing enterprises. The formation of the empire was thus an unorganized process based on piecemeal acquisition, sometimes with the British government being the least willing partner in the enterprise. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Crown exercised control over its colonies, chiefly in the areas of trade and shipping. In accordance with the mercantilist philosophy of the time, the colonies were regarded as a source of necessary raw materials for England and were granted monopolies for their products, such as tobacco and sugar in the British market. In return, they were expected to conduct all their trade by means of English ships and to serve as markets for British manufactured goods. The Navigation Act of 1651 and subsequent acts set up a closed economy between Britain and its colonies. All colonial exports had to be shipped on English ships to the British market, and all colonial imports had to come by way of England. This arrangement lasted until the combined effects of the Scottish economist Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, 1776, the loss of the American colonies, and the growth of a free trade movement in Britain slowly brought it to an end in the first half of the 19th century, the transatlantic. Trade in enslaved people took on considerable importance to Britain's colonial economy in the Americas, and it became an economic necessity for the Caribbean colonies and for the southern parts of the future United States. Movements for the end of slavery came to fruition in British colonial possessions long before the similar movement in the United States. The trade was abolished in 1807 and slavery itself in Britain's dominions in 1833. Competition with France-British military and naval power, under the leadership of such men as Robert Clive, James Wolfe, and Eyre Coote, gained for Britain two of the most important parts of its empire, Canada and India. Fighting between the British and French colonies in North America was endemic in the first half of the 18th century, but the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in North America, left Britain dominant in Canada. In India, the East India Company was confronted by the French Compagnie des Indes, but Robert Clive's military victories against the French and the rulers of Bengal in the 1750s provided the British with a massive accession of territory and ensured their future supremacy in India. The loss of Britain's 13 American colonies in 1776-83 was compensated by new settlements in Australia from 1788 and by the spectacular growth of Upper Canada, now Ontario, after the emigration of Loyalists from what had become the United States. The Napoleonic Wars provided further additions to the empire. The Treaty of Amiens, 1802, made Trinidad and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, officially British, and in the Treaty of Paris, 1814, France ceded Tobago, Mauritius, St. Lucia, and Malta. Malacca joined the empire in 1795, and Sir Stamford Raffles acquired Singapore in 1819. Canadian settlements in Alberta, Manitoba, and British Columbia extended British influence to the Pacific, while further British conquests in India brought in the United Provinces of Agra and Oudh and the Central Provinces, East Bengal and Assam, dominance and dominions. The 19th century marked the full flower of the British Empire. Administration and policy changed during the century from the haphazard arrangements of the 17th and 18th centuries to the sophisticated system, characteristic of Joseph Chamberlain's tenure, 1895-1900, in the Colonial Office. That office, which began in 1801, was first an appendage of the Home Office and the Board of Trade, but by the 1850s it had become a separate department with a growing staff and a continuing policy. It was the means by which discipline and pressure were exerted on the colonial governments when such action was considered necessary. New Zealand became officially British in 1840, after which systematic colonization there followed rapidly, partly owing to pressure from missionaries. British control was extended to Fiji, Tonga, Papua, and other islands in the Pacific Ocean, and in 1877 the British High Commission for the Western Pacific Islands was created. In the wake of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown assumed the East India Company's governmental authority in India. Britain's acquisition of Burma, Myanmar, was completed in 1886, while its conquest of the Punjab, 1849, and of Balochistan, 1854-76, provided substantial new territory in the Indian subcontinent itself. The French completion of the Suez Canal, 1869, provided Britain with a much shorter sea route to India. Britain responded to this opportunity by expanding its port at Aden, establishing a protectorate in Somaliland, now Somalia, and extending its influence in the sheikdoms of southern Arabia and the Persian Gulf. Cyprus, which was, like Gibraltar and Malta, a link in the chain of communication with India through the Mediterranean, was occupied in 1878. Elsewhere, British influence in the Far East expanded with the development of the Straits settlements and the Federated Malay States. And in the 1880s, protectorates were formed over Brunei and Sarawak. Hong Kong Island became British in 1841, and an informal empire operated in China by way of British treaty ports and the great trading city of Shanghai. The greatest 19th century extension of British power took place in Africa, however. Britain was the acknowledged ruling force in Egypt from 1882 and in the Sudan from 1899. In the second half of the century, the Royal Niger Company began to extend British influence in Nigeria, and the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and the Gambia also became British possessions. The Imperial British East Africa Company operated in what are now Kenya and Uganda, and the British South Africa Company operated in what are now Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia, Zambia, formerly Northern Rhodesia, and Malawi. Britain's victory in the South African War, 1899-1902, enabled it to annex the Transvaal and the Orange Free State in 1902 and to create the Union of South Africa in 1910, the resulting chain of British territories stretching from South Africa northward to Egypt realized an enthusiastic British public's idea of an African empire extending from the Cape to Cairo. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire comprised nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and more than 1/4 of its total population. the greatest 19th century extension of British power took place in Africa. However, Britain was the acknowledged ruling force in Egypt from 1882 and in the Sudan from 1899. In the second half of the century, the Royal Niger Company began to extend British influence in Nigeria, and the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and the Gambia also became British possessions. The Imperial British East Africa Company operated in what are now Kenya and Uganda, and the British South Africa Company operated in what are now Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia, Zambia, formerly Northern Rhodesia, and Malawi. Britain's victory in the South African War, 1899-1902, enabled it to annex the Transvaal and the Orange Free State in 1902 and to create the Union of South Africa in 1910, the resulting chain of British territories stretching from South Africa northward to Egypt realized an enthusiastic British public's idea of an African empire extending from the Cape to Cairo. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire comprised nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and more than 1/4 of its total population. This select group of nations within the empire, with substantial European populations and long experience of British forms and practices, was often referred to as the British Commonwealth. The demands and stresses of World War I and its aftermath led to a more formal recognition of the special status of the dominions. When Britain had declared war on Germany in 1914, it was on behalf of the entire empire, the dominions as well as the colonies. But after World War I ended in 1918, the dominions signed the peace treaties for themselves and joined the newly formed League of Nations as independent states equal to Britain. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster recognized them as independent countries within the British Empire, equal in status to the United Kingdom. The statute referred specifically to the British Commonwealth of Nations. When World War II broke out in 1939, the Dominions made their own declarations of war. The rest of the British Empire consisted for the most part of colonies and other dependencies whose predominant indigenous populations had no such experience. For them, a variety of administrative techniques was tried, ranging from the sophisticated Indian civil service, with its largely effective adoption of native practices in civil law and administration, to the very loose and indirect supervision exercised in a number of African territories, where settlers and commercial interests were left much to themselves while native Africans were segregated into reserves. Nationalism and the Commonwealth nationalist sentiment developed rapidly in many of these areas after World War I, and even more so after World War II, with the result that, beginning with India in 1947, independence was granted them, along with the option of retaining an association with Great Britain and other former dependencies in the Commonwealth of Nations. The adjective British was not used officially after 1946. Indian and Pakistani independence was followed by that of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and Burma, Myanmar in 1948. The Gold Coast became the first sub-Saharan African colony to reach independence, as Ghana in 1957. The movement of Britain's remaining colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean toward self-government gained speed in the years after 1960 as international pressure mounted, especially at the United Nations. As the notion of independence spread in the colonies themselves, and as the British public, which was no longer actively imperial in its sentiments, accepted the idea of independence as a foregone conclusion, the last significant British colony, Hong Kong, was returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. By then, virtually nothing remained of the empire. The Commonwealth, however, remained a remarkably flexible and durable institution. Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence. In U.S. history, document that was approved by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, and that announced the separation of 13 North American British colonies from Great Britain. It explained why the Congress on July 2nd, unanimously, by the votes of 12 colonies, with New York abstaining, had resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states. Accordingly, The day on which final separation was officially voted was July 2nd, although the 4th, the day on which the Declaration of Independence was adopted, has always been celebrated in the United States as the great national holiday, the 4th of July, or Independence Day, toward independence on April 19, 1775, when the battles of Lexington and Concord initiated armed conflict between Britain and the 13 colonies, the nucleus of the future United States. The Americans claimed that they sought only their rights within the British Empire. At that time, few of the colonists consciously desired to separate from Britain. As the American Revolution proceeded during 1775-76, and Britain undertook to assert its sovereignty by means of large armed forces, making only a gesture toward conciliation, the majority of Americans increasingly came to believe that they must secure their rights outside the empire. The losses and restrictions that came from the war greatly widened the breach between the colonies and the mother country. Moreover, it was necessary to assert independence in order to secure as much French aid as possible. On April 12, 1776, the Revolutionary Convention of North Carolina specifically authorized its delegates in the Congress to vote for independence. On May 15, the Virginia Convention instructed its deputies to offer the motion that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, which was brought forward in the Congress by Richard Henry Lee on June 7th. John Adams of Massachusetts seconded the motion. By that time, the Congress had already taken long steps toward severing ties with Britain. It had denied parliamentary sovereignty over the colonies as early as December 6, 1775, and on May 10, 1776, it had advised the colonies to establish governments of their own choice, and declared it to be absolutely irreconcilable. To reason in good conscience for the people of these colonies now to take the oaths and affirmations necessary for the support of any government under the Crown of Great Britain, whose authority ought to be totally suppressed and taken over by the people. A determination which, as Adams said, inevitably involved a struggle for absolute independence. The passage of Lee's resolution was delayed for several reasons. Some of the delegates had not yet received authorization to vote for separation. A few were opposed to taking the final step, and several men, among them John Dickinson, believed that the formation of a central government, together with attempts to secure foreign aid, should precede it. However, a committee consisting of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston was promptly chosen on June 11th to prepare a statement justifying the decision to assert independence should it be taken. The document was prepared, and on July 1st, 9 delegations voted for separation, despite warm opposition on the part of Dickinson. On the following day at the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall in Philadelphia, with the New York delegation abstaining only because it lacked permission to act, the Lee resolution was voted on and endorsed. The Convention of New York gave its consent on July 9th, and the New York delegates voted affirmatively on July 15th. On July 19th, the Congress ordered the document to be engrossed as the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. It was accordingly put on parchment, probably by Timothy Matlack of Philadelphia. Members of the Congress present on August 2nd affixed their signatures to this parchment copy on that day, and others later. The signers were as follows: John Hancock, President; Samuel Adams, John Adams, Robert Treat Paine, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts; Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton of Georgia; William Hooper, Joseph Hughes, and John Penn of North Carolina; Edward Rutledge, Thomas Hayward, Jr., Thomas Lynch, Jr., and Arthur Middleton of South Carolina; Samuel Chase, William Paca, Thomas Stone, and Charles Carroll of Maryland; George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, Thomas Nelson, Jr., Francis Lightfoot Lee, and Carter Braxton of Virginia; Robert Morris, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, John Morton, George Clymer, James Smith, George Taylor, James Wilson, and George Ross of Pennsylvania; Caesar Rodney and George Reed of Delaware; William Floyd, Philip Livingston, Francis Lewis, and Lewis Morris of New York; Richard Stockton, John Witherspoon, Francis Hopkinson, John Hart, and Abraham Clark of New Jersey, Josiah Bartlett, William Whipple, and Matthew Thornton of New Hampshire, Stephen Hopkins and William Ellery of Rhode Island, and Roger Sherman, Samuel Huntington, William Williams, and Oliver Wolcott of Connecticut. The last signer was Thomas McKean of Delaware, whose name was not placed on the document before 1777. The nature and influence of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was written largely by Jefferson, who had displayed talent as a political philosopher and polemicist in his A Summary View of the Rights of British America, published in 1774. At the request of his fellow committee members, he wrote the first draft. The members of the committee made a number of merely semantic changes, and they also expanded somewhat the list of charges against the king. The Congress made more substantial changes, deleting a condemnation of the British people, a reference to Scotch and foreign mercenaries — there were Scots in the Congress — and a denunciation of the African slave trade, this being offensive to some Southern and New England delegates. It can be said, as Adams did, that the Declaration contained nothing really novel in its political philosophy, which was derived from John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and other English theorists. James Madison offered a different perspective. The object was to assert, not to discover truth, he said. It may also be asserted that the argument offered was not without flaws in history and logic. Substantially abandoning contention on the basis of the rights of Englishmen, the Declaration put forth the more fundamental doctrines of natural rights and of government under social contract. Claiming that Parliament never truly possessed sovereignty over the colonies and that the Crown of Right exercised it only under contract, the Declaration contended that George III, with the support of a pretended legislature, had persistently violated the agreement between himself as governor and the Americans as the governed. A long list of accusations was offered toward proving this contention. The right and duty of revolution were then invoked. Few will now claim that government arose among men as Locke and Jefferson said it did, and the social contract theory has lost vogue among political scientists. It is likewise true from a British viewpoint that Parliament and Crown could not be separated, and that the history of the colonies after 1607 was not entirely consistent with the assertion that Parliament had never as of right possessed sovereignty over them. Furthermore, the specific charges brought against the king were partisan and not uniformly defensible, and the general accusation that he intended to establish an absolute despotism is hardly warranted. It should be added that several of the heaviest specific complaints condemned actions of the British government taken after the beginning of hostilities. The defects in the Declaration of Independence are not sufficient to force the conclusion that the document is unsound. On the contrary, it was in essence morally just and politically valid. If the right of revolution cannot be established on historical grounds, it nevertheless rests solidly upon ethical ones. The right of the colonists to government ultimately of their own choice is valid. Some of the phrases of the Declaration have steadily exerted profound influence in the United States, especially the proclamation, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Although the meanings of these phrases, together with conclusions drawn from them, have been endlessly debated, the Declaration has served to justify the extension of American political and social democracy. The Declaration of Independence has also been a source of inspiration outside the United States. It encouraged Antonio de Nariño and Francisco de Miranda to strive toward overthrowing the Spanish Empire in South America, and it was quoted with enthusiasm by the Marquis de Mirabeau during the French Revolution. It remains a great historical landmark in that it contained the first formal assertion by a whole people of their right to a government of their own choice. What Locke had contended for as an individual, the Americans proclaimed as a body politic. Moreover, they made good the argument by force of arms. Since 1952, the original parchment document of the Declaration of Independence has resided in the National Archives Exhibition Hall in Washington, D.C.